There is a photograph from 1913 that almost looks ordinary. Three men stand together: King George V of Britain, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. They were cousins. They shared Queen Victoria as a grandmother. They knew one another personally. They attended family weddings, exchanged gifts, and wrote private letters using the nicknames they had known since childhood. But they were not just relatives. They sat at the center of three enormous empires. And within only a few years, that family photograph would look like an image from another world. Nicholas would lose his throne and eventually be executed with his family. Wilhelm would flee Germany and spend the rest of his life in exile. But George, the quiet cousin in Britain, would remain king. Around him, monarchies that had ruled for centuries were disappearing. The Romanovs fell, the Habsburgs fell, the Hohenzollerns fell. The Ottoman dynasty would soon be swept away as well. Yet the British crown survived. And that creates a much bigger question than simply why one king got lucky. Why did Britain's monarchy survive when so many other royal houses could not? The answer was not military strength. It was not divine right. And it was not because the British loved their monarchs more than everyone else did. The answer had been developing for centuries. Again and again, Britain's kings and queens discovered a brutal rule of political survival. When a monarch refuses to surrender power, the entire institution can be destroyed with him. But when the crown gives something up before the public is forced to take it, the crown buys time. Britain learned that lesson painfully. It even executed one of its own kings. And that is where the real story begins. England, in 1215, was not a stable kingdom. Quietly developing democracy, it was a country in crisis. King John had alienated much of the political elite around him. He demanded money. He seized property. He imprisoned opponents. And he had little of the military prestige that might have made those abuses easier to tolerate. Eventually, the barons decided they had had enough. They confronted the king and forced him to accept a written agreement. The document became known as Magna Carta. At the time, it was not a democratic constitution. It was not written to give ordinary English people modern political rights. It was largely an agreement between powerful elites and a king they no longer trusted. But one idea inside it proved far more important than anyone in 1215 could have understood. The king could be limited. He was not completely separate from the law. He could not simply treat political power as an unlimited personal possession. Over the centuries, that idea became more powerful than the original document. England's councils gradually evolved. The institution that became Parliament gained influence. The crown still mattered enormously. Kings could still wage wars, reward supporters, punish enemies, and shape the direction of the country. But they increasingly had to negotiate. That distinction would eventually separate Britain from many of the monarchies that later collapsed. Russia's Tsars held tightly to autocratic government. Other European royal houses also fought to preserve centralized authority. England was moving, slowly and painfully, in another direction. Its monarchy was being forced to live with limits, not because English kings were naturally wiser, not because they woke up one morning and decided constitutional government was morally superior. They accepted limits because political conflict repeatedly left them with no better option. And that matters. The British monarchy did not survive because it always made the right decision. It survived because its worst mistakes sometimes became permanent lessons. Magna Carta was one of the first. But it was only a warning. 4 centuries later, another king would test how much authority the crown could still claim. This time, Parliament would not answer with a document. It would answer with an army. Charles I came to the throne in 1625, believing deeply in royal authority. The problem was that Parliament had its own understanding of where that authority ended. Charles dissolved Parliament repeatedly. He raised money in ways his opponents considered unlawful. His religious policies created further hostility. Each confrontation made compromise harder. By 1642, the argument was no longer taking place inside a chamber. England was at war with itself. Royalists fought for the king. Parliamentary forces fought against him. What followed was not a minor constitutional dispute. It was a brutal civil war that tore through Britain for years. Eventually, the king lost. Parliament's forces, associated above all with Oliver Cromwell, captured Charles. Then England crossed a line that would have seemed almost unimaginable to earlier generations. It put its king on trial. Charles was accused of treason, and on the 30th of January, 1649, he was executed. England cut off the head of its own monarch. For anyone tempted to believe that the British crown survived because the English people were simply too loyal to overthrow it, this moment destroys the argument. They had overthrown it. They had abolished it. For more than a decade, there was no king. England became a republic, eventually dominated by Cromwell's military government. The monarchy appeared to have reached the same end that later royal houses would experience elsewhere in Europe. But then something unusual happened. It came back. After Cromwell died, the political system he had built failed to hold together. In 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne. But restoration did not mean England had simply erased the previous 11 years. A king returned. The old assumptions about kingship did not fully return with him. The crown had now experienced something almost no monarchy ever wanted to experience. It knew abolition was possible. It knew the population could live without a king. It knew Parliament could become strong enough to defeat the crown militarily. And above all, it knew that claiming unlimited authority could end with a monarch standing before an executioner. That memory became part of Britain's political DNA. Still, royal ambition did not disappear. The lesson had been taught. That did not mean every king had learned it. Only a few decades later, James II would once again push the monarchy toward confrontation. And this time, Parliament would discover something even more dangerous to royal power. It could replace a king without destroying the monarchy itself. James II created another crisis. He was Catholic in a country where the political establishment was overwhelmingly Protestant. He placed Catholics in important positions. He clashed with Parliament. And when his wife produced a male heir, the prospect suddenly appeared that England could face a continuing Catholic dynasty. For powerful Protestant leaders, that was too much. So they did something extraordinary. They invited James's own daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to take the throne. James fled. William and Mary became monarchs. The episode became known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but the most important part of the story came afterward. William and Mary did not simply inherit the same royal authority James had tried to exercise. The Bill of Rights of 1689 placed major restrictions on the crown. The monarch could not suspend laws whenever he wished. Taxes required parliamentary consent. Maintaining a standing army in peacetime also depended on Parliament. Parliamentary elections and parliamentary speech received protections. Britain had crossed another threshold. The monarchy was not disappearing. It was becoming constitutional. That may sound like a loss. For the individual sitting on the throne, it was. But for the institution, it became one of the greatest advantages it ever received, because political responsibility began moving away from the monarch. Over time, Parliament and ministers increasingly governed. The crown remained, but the crown was becoming something different. The distinction would prove critical. Imagine an economic crisis under an absolute monarch. People lose their jobs. Food becomes scarce. A war goes badly. Taxes rise. Soldiers die. Who is responsible? If the ruler personally controls policy, the answer is obvious: the ruler. Now, imagine the same crisis inside a constitutional system. A government can fall, a prime minister can be replaced, elections can change parliament. Political anger has somewhere to go without requiring the destruction of the entire state. That was the shield Britain gradually built around its monarchy. The king could remain while governments came and went. The monarch could symbolize the country while elected politicians absorbed the anger created by governing it. Russia never developed a comparable shield strong enough to protect Nicholas II. He insisted on retaining enormous personal authority. And when Russia collapsed under the pressure of war, hunger, military failure, and unrest, there was nowhere else for public rage to go. Nicholas had wanted authority. He received responsibility with it. In Britain, power was being transferred away from the crown. So was blame. That trade would become one of the monarchy's greatest survival mechanisms. And nowhere would its value become clearer than in 1917. Because that year, King George V watched his own relatives lose almost everything. The First World War placed Europe's old political order under extraordinary pressure. Millions of men were fighting. Economies were strained. Food shortages and political anger were spreading. Governments that had looked permanent suddenly looked fragile. Russia broke first. Nicholas II had long believed strongly in autocratic rule. Even as pressure for reform increased, he struggled to accept the idea that the authority of the Tsar should be permanently reduced. Then war magnified every weakness in the Russian system. Military losses mounted. Economic conditions deteriorated. Public confidence collapsed. Workers and soldiers filled the streets. In March 1917, Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, was finished. 16 months later, Nicholas and his family were killed. For George V in London, this was not distant news from a foreign capital. Nicholas was his cousin. The two men looked strikingly alike. They had known one another since childhood. Now one of them had lost his crown. Soon, other thrones were collapsing too. Kaiser Wilhelm II would be driven from Germany. The Habsburg monarchy would disappear with the collapse of Austria-Hungary. The old imperial order was unraveling. Britain was not immune to the same forces. British soldiers were returning from a horrific war. Labor unrest was growing. Socialist ideas were spreading. The public had sacrificed enormously. And Britain's royal family had another problem. Its official dynastic name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It was German. That had not always been a serious problem. Queen Victoria had married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and their descendants carried the family name. But now Britain was fighting Germany. British soldiers were dying in battles against German forces. German aircraft were bombing British cities, and in 1917, Gotha bombers attacked London. Suddenly, the royal family's German name was more than an awkward family detail. It was dangerous. George had a choice. He could defend tradition. He could argue that his ancestry had nothing to do with his loyalty to Britain. He could insist that a royal dynasty should not have to change its identity because public opinion had turned against Germany. Instead, he changed the identity. On the 17th of July, 1917, the old dynastic name was abandoned. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha disappeared. The House of Windsor was born. Windsor sounded English. Windsor Castle evoked history, continuity, and permanence. At the exact moment European monarchies were being blamed for belonging to an old world, the British royal family gave itself a new name connected to the nation's past. It looked like branding. But underneath the branding was survival. And George was about to make an even colder decision, one involving the cousin who had just lost everything. After Nicholas II was removed from power, the question arose of whether Britain might provide refuge for the former Tsar and his family. At first glance, the answer might seem obvious. George and Nicholas were relatives. They had grown up inside the same network of European royal families. But George faced a political calculation. Nicholas represented exactly the kind of autocratic monarchy that revolutionary movements were attacking. Bringing the Romanovs to Britain could connect the British crown in the public imagination with the failed Russian regime. Republican feeling existed in Britain. The political atmosphere was unstable. George feared the consequences, and so the possibility of British refuge disappeared. The decision remains one of the coldest moments in the story. The family relationship mattered. The institution mattered more. Nicholas and his family remained in Russia. Their story ended in violence. George's monarchy survived. That does not make the decision morally comfortable, but it reveals how seriously the Windsors had begun to think about survival. Everything that made the crown look distant, foreign, irresponsible, or politically dangerous had to be reconsidered. That same instinct appeared in George's public behavior during the war. He visited troops. He went to hospitals. He toured factories. He made himself physically visible. In 1915, while visiting forces in France, he was thrown from a horse and suffered a serious injury that affected him for years. These appearances helped create a different image of monarchy, not a ruler issuing orders from far above society, a king seen participating in national sacrifice. The strategy did not eliminate future crises. In fact, one arrived inside the family itself. In 1936, George V's eldest son, Edward VIII, wanted to marry Wallis Simpson. She was an American and twice divorced. The proposed marriage created religious, constitutional, and political problems. Edward faced a choice: the woman he wanted, or the crown. He chose Wallis. In December 1936, Edward abdicated. For an institution built around continuity, the king voluntarily leaving the throne should have been devastating. Yet the system absorbed the shock. Edward left. His younger brother Albert became King George VI. That transition demonstrated something important. The monarchy had become larger than the monarch. A king could fail. A king could even walk away. The crown could continue. That was a luxury the old absolute monarchies rarely possessed. Their rulers and their regimes were often inseparable. Britain had spent centuries separating the two. Soon that distinction would be tested by another world war. And the shy man who had never expected to become king would become one of the monarchy's most important symbols of survival. George VI did not arrive on the throne as an obvious national hero. He was reserved. He suffered from a severe stammer. He had spent most of his life expecting his older brother to become king. Then Edward abdicated and George inherited a role he had never prepared to seek. 3 years later, Britain was at war again. The Second World War created exactly the kind of crisis that could destroy a royal house. Across Europe, monarchies were being compromised, displaced, or eliminated. In Britain, the crown responded in the way it had increasingly learned to respond. It became visible. When German bombs fell on London, George VI and Queen Elizabeth remained in Britain. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed. The royal family visited damaged neighborhoods. They met people whose homes had been destroyed. They used rationing. They delivered broadcasts. The monarchy could not command the Royal Air Force's strategy. It could not determine military policy. It could not decide how the war would be fought. But that limitation was precisely the point. The crown did not need to run the war to become associated with national endurance. It needed to be present. Other royal families made very different calculations. Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III had tied himself closely enough to Mussolini that the monarchy's reputation was badly damaged. After the war, Italians voted to abolish it. Other European monarchies disappeared as well. Britain's survived. Again, the difference was not that the British king possessed more authority. He possessed less. The crown had spent centuries separating symbolic leadership from political responsibility. Now it could stand beside the population without being held responsible for every military failure or government mistake. That was an extraordinary political position. Visible without governing. Important without deciding policy. National without being partisan. The monarchy had gradually transformed itself from a center of political command into a center of symbolism. And symbols behave differently from governments. Governments can lose elections. Prime ministers can become hated. Policies can fail. Parties can be swept from office. But a symbol of national continuity can survive all of those changes if enough people continue to believe it represents something larger. George VI embodied that role during the war. Then, in 1952, he died. His 25-year-old daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. She inherited a monarchy that had survived revolution, civil war, republican government, 2 world wars, abdication, and the collapse of royal houses across Europe. But the institution now faced a new problem. The empire that had given the British crown global power was disappearing. If monarchy had once been inseparable from empire, what would happen when the empire was gone? Elizabeth's answer would redefine the institution again. When Elizabeth II became queen in 1952, Britain's imperial world was already changing rapidly. India had become independent 5 years earlier. Other territories in Africa and the Caribbean were moving towards self-government and independence. The British Empire, once the largest empire in the world, was shrinking. For the monarchy, this created an existential problem. For generations, the crown had been tied to imperial authority. British monarchs had ruled over an enormous network of territories. Now those territories were becoming independent countries. A monarchy unable to separate itself from empire could have declined with the empire. Instead, the institution shifted toward the Commonwealth. Independent countries could remain connected through a voluntary association. The monarch's role became increasingly symbolic rather than imperial. Once again, political power diminished. Relevance survived. Elizabeth also understood another force transforming society: mass media. Her coronation in 1953 was televised. Some advisors worried that allowing cameras into Westminster Abbey would make monarchy less mysterious. Elizabeth supported allowing television coverage. The result exposed royal ceremony to an audience on a scale previous monarchs could hardly have imagined. Millions watched. The monarchy had entered people's homes. That change mattered because traditional royal authority was disappearing. Media visibility could replace some of what political power once provided. Elizabeth became less a governing figure than a permanent public presence. In 1969, the BBC documentary Royal Family went even further. Viewers saw scenes that earlier generations would have considered too private. The royal family eating, relaxing, shopping, cooking outdoors. The intention was to make them more human and accessible. Again, the crown was adjusting the distance between monarchy and public. Too distant, and it could appear irrelevant. Too ordinary, and it could lose mystique. Elizabeth spent much of her reign balancing those two risks. One of her most important strategies was silence. She met prime ministers, she read government papers, she was informed about political affairs, but publicly, she avoided partisan positions. That neutrality became one of the foundations of her authority. 15 prime ministers came and went during her reign. Britain moved through the Cold War, decolonization, Northern Ireland's troubles, the Falklands War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Brexit, technological revolution, and a global pandemic. Governments changed, parties changed, public arguments changed. The Queen remained. That continuity became her political value precisely because she was not acting like a politician. And here lies the central paradox of the modern monarchy. Elizabeth became enormously significant because she possessed very little direct governing power. The crown survived by becoming less powerful and more symbolic. And by the end of her 70-year reign, that strategy looked almost unbeatable. But underneath that success was another question. If the monarchy's survival depended so heavily on Elizabeth herself, what would happen when she was gone? By the modern era, almost every meaningful governing power once associated with monarchy had moved elsewhere. Parliament legislated, elected government set policy, prime ministers governed. The military operated under constitutional government. The monarch remained head of state, but the crown no longer functioned like the monarchies of earlier centuries. At first, that sounds like defeat, but viewed through the history of royal survival, it begins to look like an extraordinary trade. Every time the monarchy lost political authority, it also lost part of the political danger attached to that authority. A ruler who sets taxes is blamed for taxes. A ruler who commands a disastrous war is blamed for the war. A ruler who controls government becomes the obvious target when government fails. The British monarch increasingly did none of those things. And so the crown became difficult to attack through the normal mechanisms of political anger. This survival strategy even shaped the monarchy's financial presentation. The Crown Estate owns a vast portfolio of land and property, but it is managed independently. Its profits go to the Treasury. For 2024 to 2025, the transcript reports that the Crown Estate generated about £1.15 billion in net revenue profit. In return, the monarchy receives the sovereign grant, reported at £132.1 million for 2025 to 2026. Supporters can therefore make a simple argument. The Crown generates value, the state funds the Crown. The transcript also cites an estimated £1.8 billion broader annual economic contribution connected to tourism, trade, and brand value. Whether every citizen accepts that calculation is almost secondary to the survival strategy behind it. The important point is positioning. The monarchy does not want to be understood merely as an inherited privilege that costs the public money. It wants to be seen as useful, economically useful, culturally useful, diplomatically useful, emotionally useful. That is exactly the same pattern visible throughout the previous 8 centuries. When one justification weakens, another must replace it. Divine right weakened, constitutional symbolism replaced it, empire disappeared, Commonwealth relevance replaced it, political command disappeared, national ceremony and continuity replaced it, and then Elizabeth II died in September 2022. The crown passed to Charles III. For the first time in 70 years, Britain had to find out whether people had been loyal to the institution itself or to the extraordinary woman who had embodied it for most of their lives. That test is still unfolding. The monarchy Charles III inherited is not facing exactly the same danger George V faced in 1917. There are no collapsing European empires surrounding Britain. There is no revolutionary wave taking royal families down one after another. The danger is quieter. Public indifference, generational change, financial scrutiny, scandal, a media environment in which every mistake can travel around the world instantly. According to the figures cited in the transcript, support for retaining the monarchy has fallen sharply from the levels seen during Elizabeth II's reign. The generational gap is even more serious. Younger Britons are significantly less supportive of monarchy than older generations. That may be the most important challenge the institution now faces. For centuries, the crown survived by knowing when an old model had stopped working. King John was forced to accept limits. Charles I showed what happened when a king pushed too far. The Glorious Revolution moved power toward Parliament. George V abandoned a German dynastic identity when it became politically poisonous. George VI turned the crown into a symbol of shared national endurance. Elizabeth II separated monarchy from the disappearing empire and mastered television, ceremony, neutrality, and modern media. Each generation inherited an institution that looked permanent. Each generation discovered that permanence had conditions. Charles appears to understand at least part of that history. The transcript points to efforts to slim down the working monarchy, provide greater financial transparency, and maintain the crown's association with environmental and charitable causes. But the deeper question cannot be solved by one announcement. Can the monarchy remain emotionally important to people who no longer feel the attachment their parents or grandparents did? Can an inherited institution continue to justify itself in a society increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege? Can the crown preserve enough mystery to feel special while becoming transparent enough to maintain public trust? Those are not small questions. They go directly to the rule that has governed the institution's survival for centuries. Adapt before adaptation is forced upon you. Give up what has become dangerous before defending it becomes fatal. Make the institution useful in the world that exists now, not the world in which it was created. That is what the Romanovs failed to do. Nicholas II protected autocratic authority until authority itself became a liability. The Habsburgs could not preserve a political system built for an imperial world that was breaking apart. The Hohenzollerns disappeared with Germany's imperial order. The Ottomans could not hold together an empire facing forces it could no longer control. Britain's monarchy followed another path. It became smaller. It surrendered the power to tax, the power to legislate, the power to govern, the power to command policy. Piece by piece, century by century, The monarchy gave away many of the things that once defined what monarchy meant, and in return it received something the far more powerful royal houses around it lost: time. That may be the strangest lesson of the entire story. Power and survival are not always the same thing. Sometimes keeping an institution alive requires surrendering the very powers the institution was originally created to exercise. Return to that photograph from 1913. George, Nicholas, Wilhelm, three cousins standing inside a world that seemed permanent. None of them could see clearly how quickly that world was about to disappear. Nicholas lost his throne, then his life. Wilhelm lost his empire and died in exile. George kept his crown. Not because his monarchy was stronger in the old sense, because Britain had spent centuries teaching its monarchy how to survive weakness. That lesson carried the crown through 1917, through abdication, through another world war, through the end of empire, through 70 years of Elizabeth II. But history offers no lifetime guarantee. The Romanovs lasted 3 centuries. The Habsburgs dominated European affairs for hundreds of years. The Ottoman dynasty endured for more than 6 centuries. All of them eventually reached a generation that could no longer adapt fast enough. The British monarchy has escaped that fate again and again. So far, the question now is whether the next generation of Windsors understands the same thing George V understood while crowns were falling around him. Survival is not something a dynasty inherits. It is something every generation has to earn again. So, where do you think Britain is heading? Has the monarchy mastered adaptation so completely that it can survive another century? Or are the falling support numbers telling us that its greatest challenge may still be ahead? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about the hidden decisions, institutions, and power structures that shaped history, leave a like and subscribe to Forgotten Code. I'll see you in the next